Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the counselors in the counseling department at Our Voice, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit today about some of the common impacts of trauma. So, first, we'll kind of take a look at how trauma works and why it is that we're left with so many symptoms afterwards, and then we'll explore kind of common impacts in several different areas of our lives. So, where we'll start is just kind of with the definition of trauma. So, what makes an experience traumatic is not so much the experience itself, kind of the nature of it, but actually the individual's internal experience of whatever's happening. So, with trauma, what happens is that our coping resources are overwhelmed, and when that happens, we're not able to process the experience that we're having. And when that happens, survival responses take over in our brain and body, which send us into fight, flight, or freeze responses. When that happens, there's kind of a complex brain circuitry that gets tripped off that prevents the normal kind of memory encoding process. So when that happens, instead of the experience being processed and going into long-term memory, it stays in working memory or short-term memory. So that's really why it is that we kind of experience so many lasting impacts, because our systems aren't really able to process and integrate the experience. So when that happens, the trauma continues to kind of live on the surface. It's almost like our brain and our bodies don't really recognize that it's over, that it's now in the past. It's as if it's still happening. So, because of that, a lot of the kind of almost artifacts of our traumatic experience at the level of our emotions, our body sensations, our thoughts tend to persist. So let's first take a look at kind of some of the emotional symptoms of sexual trauma. So, one of the hallmarks of trauma in general is the loss of safety and connection. So, what does that mean? So, we lose the ability to connect with ourselves internally, oftentimes because of all of the kind of overwhelm, all of those remnants, because they're still online. If we were to feel really connected to ourselves, we would have to experience a lot of the distress that we experienced during the trauma that hasn't been resolved yet. So oftentimes what happens is that we kind of disconnect from ourselves just to avoid that stimulation. So we also lose connection with others in relationships, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And thirdly, we lose connection with the world at large, because the world, in the aftermath of a trauma that hasn't been able to be integrated yet, the world becomes kind of a threatening, unsafe, sometimes kind of unfamiliar place. So really, it's almost as if everywhere we turn, it's not safe. It's not safe inside of us. It's not safe with other people. It's not safe in nature and in the world at large. So the world becomes, as you can see, kind of a very unpleasant place to be. So with the emotions, oftentimes we'll get dysregulation in two extremes. We'll either get what's called hyperarousal, kind of too much stimulation in our nervous system, or hypoarousal, where we don't have enough stimulation. So some of the symptoms of hyperarousal kind of look like what we typically think of with trauma. Somebody who's hypervigilant, they're kind of on edge, can't relax, kind of checking, looking over their shoulder. It also looks like anxiety or having panic attacks. Sometimes it can also look like anger or rage, kind of flying off the handle, acting out violently. It's much more common among male survivors, mainly because aggression and violence are really condoned as masculine ideals in our society. And on the other hand, with hypoarousal, that looks more like kind of what we think about in terms of depression. So it's kind of a sense of kind of isolation, feeling quite fatigued, not having motivation, just feeling very low, kind of feeling shame, kind of a predominant, state of kind of blaming oneself for what happened is very common. And sometimes we get kind of more dissociative symptoms that look like um, kind of being confused, foggy, a sense of I don't really know what happened, just kind of not really here, kind of feeling numb, kind of an emptiness. Sometimes that could happen. It's kind of like not really here nor there, not really able to land fully. Um, Sometimes, folks experience shock. It's almost a sense of I can't really even acknowledge what happened. Um, and so, kind of what this means, kind of the impact of the impact, if you will, is that we're not able to be truly present in our lives. We're in such a state of kind of trying to manage dysregulation that our ability to be really in an optimal state where we're relaxed but also alert and aware is compromised. So we really have a decreased quality of life typically. It's impossible to experience lasting joy or happiness or to feel alive or to feel love, affection, connection. It's really impossible to access those states that we really crave as human beings when we're experiencing dysregulation. All right, so let's turn now to some of the cognitive symptoms. So the main thing to understand here is that we think how we feel. So what that means is if we're feeling very dysregulated, for example, if I'm overwhelmed with anxiety, I'm experiencing a lot of fear and sense of threat, my thinking is going to reflect that state of anxiety. So I might have kind of paranoid thoughts. I might be really fearful that other people are looking at me or judging me or, feeling stigmatizing of me. On the other hand, if I'm kind of in a more hyper-aroused state, more kind of depressed, shameful, kind of isolated, it might look like kind of negative thinking about myself, kind of thoughts around blaming myself, thinking, that my body is somehow kind of permanently damaged. So in that sense, the way that our thoughts will show up kind of mimics the way that our emotions are presenting. Oftentimes, it can be hard to concentrate or make decisions. Oftentimes, that's because there's so much intrusive content coming up into our awareness, either in the form of kind of intrusive thoughts about the trauma, memories. It could even be like emotional kind of flashbacks, making it hard to really, again, be present and engage with the life that's right in front of us. One more thing is kind of hyper-intellectualization. This one is, I think, less well understood or less kind of commonly recognized. But oftentimes when we experience trauma, again, our body and our emotions become kind of a war ground. So a lot of times we escape kind of into our heads and become kind of thinking beings, kind of out of contact really with our emotions and with our bodies. And that's a way to, it's an adaptive way to avoid kind of what's overwhelming. But unfortunately, it becomes unable to really resolve the trauma because we can't really be in contact with it. And we need to contact in order to actually heal it. All right. Let's see what else. So with trauma, when trauma is relational, we tend to experience especially damaging impacts in that realm, okay? So when we think about it, sexual trauma is a very profound boundary violation, okay? So when my boundary is violated, oftentimes in such a kind of scary, horrific, kind of disgusting, abrupt, confusing way, it results in kind of a loss of relationship kind of capacity, especially in the realm of setting boundaries and being assertive. So oftentimes it leaves us feeling kind of helpless or powerless in relationships. Oftentimes survivors have difficulties using their voice to communicate when they're uncomfortable. It becomes very scary to assert ourselves in relationships sometimes. And kind of along with that, it's like if you think about if I'm feeling like I can't really advocate for myself or make my needs known, I can feel very insecure in relationship. I might even want to avoid connection or avoid intimacy. So sometimes that happens where it becomes hard to really experience connection because of that kind of boundary rupture that's still kind of online for us. We don't know if we're going to be safe anymore when we're connecting with someone. So oftentimes too, because if we cut off from ourselves, which most of us do in some way, it becomes hard to actually know what we're feeling when we're in relationship, or even kind of what we're wanting or what we're not wanting. So sometimes we end up kind of functioning in relationships with too much focus on the other person. Where our attention might be around kind of meeting their needs, or being agreeable to them, being acceptable, being loved by them, kind of at all cost. There's a way that our needs and our feelings become less important, or less kind of accessible to us. So as you can imagine, it becomes really hard to feel fulfilled and connected with intimacy. Sometimes too, if we've blamed ourselves, if we're dealing with a lot of shame, which survivors often are, we might feel kind of unworthy of being treated with love and respect. And that's a huge thing. Let's see what else. So one thing too, just in terms of kind of sexuality in the relational sphere, sometimes we see kind of polarizing responses. So a person might become kind of hypersexual, much more kind of sexual than they were before the trauma happened. Oftentimes it's kind of confusing. It's like, why would I, expose myself to more sex when that's kind of what was injuring? And there's a lot of kind of reasons for that. I won't kind of go into all that here, but the basic thing to understand is that the individual is trying to kind of cope and process what happened, kind of through that behavior. Of course, it's not effective, but it often happens. And when it does happen, oftentimes the kind of the quality of sex that the person's having is very low. So it's not sex that's very fulfilling or connected. Does that make sense? It's a bit more transactional in nature oftentimes. And then on the other hand, sometimes folks become very afraid of intimacy and afraid of sexuality. And so they might kind of really avoid sexual situations in the aftermath, and really need to take some time to develop that capacity to feel safe and to develop trust again with intimacy and with sexuality. Oftentimes we've been violated by someone we're quite close with, or that we've trusted. And so that kind of rupture of trust can be really kind of shattering to our belief structures about kind of how safe we are in relationship. All right, let's turn now to some of the physical symptoms. So when we're not able to effectively confront our perpetrator, sometimes that kind of energy turns inward against ourselves. So we might start acting out against ourselves in self-destructive ways, self-harming kind of ways, kind of self-sabotaging and that kind of thing. We might engage in kind of high-risk behavior or do things that are only going to end up in us being hurt. And we can also experience a variety of health issues, oftentimes kind of located in this kind of front part of the body. So the GI system, the cardiac system, the neurological system. And so often too, kind of going with the hyperarousal, we may feel a lot of new sensation in our bodies that we weren't in contact with before, that are quite overwhelming, oftentimes in the throat, in the chest, in the belly, because the vagus nerve kind of runs right there. And then also, again, like I was saying earlier, we might experience kind of low energy states, and feeling kind of foggy, kind of brain fog, disconnected. Just not really kind of here, not really present. We might experience a lot of fatigue, actually. Okay, so spiritual symptoms. So anytime you have kind of a traumatic experience, it can really challenge your view of yourself, others, and the world. And so oftentimes survivors are grappling with kind of why did this happen? What does this mean about me? What does this mean about other people? What does it mean about me in relationship? Just a lot of kind of trying to really understand the meaning of what happened and why. And if someone is spiritual or religious, there's often a grappling with how could my higher power allow this to happen? It just doesn't make sense. I didn't deserve this. How could this be? Um, and so a lot of questioning of kind of pre-existing belief structures. And two, sometimes because we're oftentimes, if we have a lot of dysregulation, it can be really interfere with our functioning and leave us kind of feeling lost and kind of off course. We might lose connection with kind of who we are, what our purpose is in the world, kind of these big picture disruptions in kind of how we view things. And we can experience a sense of kind of existential, I would call like existential kind of isolation of just feeling kind of displaced in the world, not really feeling a sense of belonging, really that my life matters. We kind of develop a sense of being a very small being in a very big kind of threatening world. And there's a lot of kind of meaninglessness that can come up for folks around that. All right. So that about covers kind of some of the common impacts. And I'll just say a few words then to end around resiliency. So folks have very different responses to sexual trauma and trauma in general. And it's kind of like, why is that? Why do some people have such drastic symptoms and other people seem to recover more easily? This is kind of a whole topic, but just a few kind of factors that influence that. So a lot of it's really the quality of our pre-existing relationships with our caregivers and our community, kind of what our environment is like. Are we dealing with oppression? Are we dealing with poverty? Are we dealing with kind of a toxic political environment? Are we dealing with violence in our community? Or on the other hand, it's like, do we have our needs met? Are we able to have the resources that we need? Because what happens is if we're kind of managing a lot of pre-existing trauma or pre-existing or even ongoing stressors, then our system is already very taxed. And so we don't have as much kind of resource, internal resource and capacity to meet traumatic experience when we're already trying to cope with a lot of other kind of toxic negative factors in our lives. And oftentimes what we see with survivors is that this is what's happening. Sometimes it is kind of a single incident trauma, but oftentimes people are often coming in grappling with not only a sexual trauma, but also kind of a lifetime of trauma, or even just kind of caregiving that's not been very adaptive. And so a lot of kind of, it's not surprising, but a lot of the way that we're cared for in childhood determines how well we're able to cope with later on things in life. Yeah. And so this kind of sense of kind of the loss of safety and connection that I mentioned as being kind of a hallmark of trauma, it can become very ingrained when we have a lot of trauma over our lifetime. And it can become even hard to imagine a world where we feel safe and connected to ourselves and other people and the world at large. So this ends my portion. And Rebecca's going to share next about kind of how we can develop the ability to regulate our experience so that we are able to restore our functioning and really coming out of living in the shadow of trauma and back into our lives, back into our present reality. Thank you.